Hello friends, my name is Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we're taking a look at the cars of Fast and Furious in the Fast and Furious special. Now, we're going to be using cars from the Fast and Furious car park, and I'm basically going to be throwing them around the track to see how they compare to the more normal production cars, shall we say. Anyways, we start today with the Mitsubishi Eclipse GS, 355 horsepower, 3,199 pounds of weight. This is of course Brian's car from the first Fast and Furious film. Anyways, the Eclipse is kind of interesting. This is the only front-wheel drive car here today, which is kind of surprising considering they did an all-wheel drive Eclipse. Why this isn't an all-wheel drive Eclipse, I don't know. It's a front-wheel drive version. So yeah, that's actually pretty interesting, and when you look at the stats, you sort of get an idea of how this vehicle might drive. 355 horsepower in a front-wheel drive car is a lot. Like, that's, I mean, the Ford Focus RS has 300 horsepower, and I believe that's the most powerful standard front-wheel drive car in the game. Yeah. This has 55 horsepower more than that, and once you start getting to around 200 and, let's say 250 horsepower, you know, 10 horsepower can make all the difference to handling. Ultimately though, the Eclipse isn't actually all that bad. Yes, it understeers, yes, it doesn't handle anywhere near as good as sort of a more normal hot hatchback would. However, it certainly isn't a bad vehicle to drive by any stretch of the imagination. It's not particularly fun, it's not particularly amazing, but it's definitely surprising, the fact that I can stay this composed despite having this much power in a front-wheel drive car. So yeah, the Eclipse is surprising, although it's still not particularly amazing. Next up, speaking of not particularly amazing, we have the Toyota Supra. Now this is of course from the first Fast and Furious film again. 770 horsepower, 3,329 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today. 770 horsepower is an awful lot. In fact, that's 95 more horsepower than the next most powerful vehicle. However, while most cars, sort of when it comes to modifying, you know, they have various different modifications on them to make them go faster, the Supra, really when you drive it, feels like it only has one major upgrade, and that is the turbos. They're huge. Now, huge turbos mean huge turbo lag, and you definitely feel that in the Supra. Basically, between sort of 0 and 4,500 RPMs, this will just drive like a normal Supra, right? And then as soon as it hits 4,500 RPMs, the turbos spool up, the rev limiter will just go straight to the red line, and that makes this car extremely tricky to drive. It's just, you can't really go full throttle in it, because as soon as you go over 4,500 RPMs, the power delivery is just so violent and so instant. It isn't a great car to drive. I really didn't enjoy driving the Supra, especially in the wet. The handling itself is, it's alright, but with that turbo lag, as soon as you hit the throttle, you're just going to go sideways anyway. Next up, we have the Honda S2000. This is Suki's S2000 from the Too Fast, Too Furious film. Anyways, 330 horsepower, 2,813 pounds of weight. Now, we go from a very tricky car, which I didn't like to drive, to a car which I very much liked. In fact, the S2000 is probably the best car I drove here today. And in my opinion, this is almost perfect for my driving style. It's just such a neutral car. It doesn't want to slide, it doesn't want to understeer particularly. It's just a really good handling car. It's decent, it really is. In fact, to show you how decent it is, this car is a B-class vehicle, I believe it's like a mid-B class, and the Supra is S710Pi. The S2000 was only about a second off through most sectors on this track, and through the corners this was so much quicker than that Supra was, just because I really have the confidence to push the S2000. You don't get that in the Supra. In fact, you don't get that from most of the cars here today, but the S2000, it's just so pushable. It's such a likeable car to drive. It's really very good. Aside from the silly body kit, it really is a very perfect vehicle to drive. I did enjoy this and won an awful lot. Next up, a Nissan Skyline GTR. This is Brian's car from the second Fast and Furious film. 505 horsepower, 3,439 pounds of weight. This is the second heaviest car here today, which is kind of surprising. Although, interestingly enough, it is the only four-wheel drive vehicle here today. So we've had the only front-wheel drive car, and now this is the only four-wheel drive car. However, while being front-wheel drive might be a bad thing if you have 355 horsepower, being a four-wheel drive around Top Gear is very much a good thing, and especially in the wet. And this actually meant that the Skyline was very, very decent indeed. I really did like this car. It just has insane acceleration, this car. Because it has four-wheel drive, you just boot it and it will just go. Now, admittedly, it is a bit slidier than most four-wheel drive cars, but it's still pretty darn decent. You know, if you don't even have to be that careful with it, as long as you're just mindful of it, it'll be absolutely fine. Yeah, this was one of the definitely more enjoyable vehicles of the day to drive, and certainly one of the quicker. You know, despite the weight, despite the fact it's down on power compared to some of the vehicles here today, that four-wheel drive system just really helped the Skyline out a lot. Next up, Nissan Fairlady Z. This is DK's car from Tokyo Drift. 486 horsepower, 3,310 pounds of weight. So, the Nissan Fairlady Z, of course, DK stands for Drift King, and this car very much wants to go sideways a lot. This does not take much encouragement at all to get that rear end going out on it. And yeah, especially in the wet, this thing is just super slippy, super slidey. You can actually, even when I'm cornering relatively normal through these corners, you can kind of see the car sort of jolting. It really wants to get its rear end out. This does mean, ultimately, in my opinion, it's not a particularly great car to drive. I don't really like oversteer from my vehicles, and the Fairlady Z's sort of predominant character trait was oversteer. Other than that, I mean, straight line speed was okay compared to most of the vehicles here today. It is pretty far down the pecking order. I mean, it's right in the middle with its power, 486 horsepower, but the weight isn't particularly special, and yeah, it's not a great car to drive. It certainly isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination. It just doesn't suit my driving style. I'm sure if you prefer your more sideways car, you'll get a lot of fun out of the Fairlady, but for me personally, it just isn't my sort of thing. Next up, Chevrolet Corvette C2 Grand Sport. This is, I believe, from the fifth film, Fast 5. 502 horsepower, 3,384 pounds of weight. So the Corvette then. C2, old muscle car with a lot of power, and as you can see, that was a huge drift through that first corner. Other than that though, it's actually a surprisingly decent vehicle to drive. The Corvette, it definitely wants to slide. I described it as a pretty natural handling car. Like, it doesn't snap oversteer on you like, say, the Supra would, or maybe even the Fairlady in some regards. You know, this is a very gradual car, it's easy to control. Yeah, it's a pretty easy car to drive, which you wouldn't expect by just looking at it and hearing those statistics as well. Yeah, a solid car, the Corvette. Straight line speed was pretty decent as well. I mean, again, it's got a decent amount of power and it's pretty aerodynamic in form. Yeah, I wouldn't say the Corvette was one of my star cars of the day, but compared to some of the other stuff I've had to drive today, yeah, this was pretty good. And it really surprised me, considering this is actually the first time I've ever driven the C2 Corvette, so yeah, it's a pretty fun vehicle. Next up, Ford Escort RS 1600. This is from the sixth film. I believe it's featured during the highway tank battle scene. Anyways, 245 horsepower, 1,731 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful vehicle here today by a relatively decent margin. However, it is by far and away the lightest. So the Escort then, you look at those figures, 245 horsepower, 1,731 pounds of weight, you go, that's really lightweight, that's a decent amount of power. This thing should be actually pretty darn good. Unfortunately, it's not. This is a very tricky car to drive, and most of that comes down to how soft the suspension is on this thing. It just rolls into corners, it leans, it snap oversteers, because essentially the suspension sort of starts leading and then the rear end will all of a sudden just come out. It is not a particularly a good car to drive. You can just sort of see it sort of swaying everywhere on the track, you know, that's how much steering input and so on I was having to do to sort of keep this thing going in a straight line. Yeah, you can see through there, it just gets its rear tailbone out. I mean, I guess straight line speed is pretty decent, despite being the least powerful vehicle here today. It can still certainly shift, especially for a C-Class car. It's surprisingly quick, but ultimately the Escort is not a particularly great car to drive. I would avoid using the Escort if you're looking for a handling vehicle. Next up, a Dodge Charger Daytona. This is from the 6th film again. I believe this is featured in a street race. 675 horsepower, 3,131 pounds of weight. The second most powerful vehicle here today, and actually surprisingly one of the lighter vehicles. Now, in Season 3, when I drove this around the dry track, I was very much impressed with the Daytona. I really liked the way this thing drove. I honestly thought it was a pretty darn decent car. In this game, it's kind of like the Corvette, essentially. It's a nice car to drive, it's decent. It does want to get that rear end out a bit more than I remember it doing, though. I guess that's sort of partly down to the fact we're now in the wet, which of course will induce oversteer in a big powerful car like this. Just wasn't quite as good as I remembered it being, unfortunately. Still was not a bad car though. I really like this Daytona. I love the look of it. It's just such a fantastic looking car. Definitely one of my more favourite cars from the Fast and Furious film franchise, this particular Daytona. Yeah, I mean, it was a solid car for what it is. It's definitely better than you'd probably expect it to be just by looking at the stats, but yeah, I just remember this car being a lot better, which it did disappoint me, the fact that this car just isn't quite as good as I remember it, but there you go. Anyways, finally today, we have the Dodge Charger Raid from Fast 7, or sorry, Fast and Furious 7 I should say. 650 horsepower, 3,671 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest vehicle here today, however it is the third most powerful. Now, the Charger Raid, how does it drive? It is awful. This is a bad car to drive. It weighs a lot. It wants to slide everywhere. It leans all over the place. It's honestly like driving a Ford Raptor in Forza 4. That's what it feels like. Except like a rear-wheel drive Raptor with silly rally suspension on it. This is an awful car to drive. It's cool looking, sure. And it's definitely a sight to be seen going around the Top Gear track. I mean, just look at how insane this thing is. But yeah, it is not a good car to drive. It is my least favourite vehicle that I had here today by far. I mean, the Supra and the Escort were bad. This was worse than both of those. Admittedly, the Supra, not by too much, but I would much rather drive the Escort over this, and that is definitely saying something. If you're going to go for a Charger from the Fast and Furious pack, you definitely want to look towards the Daytona more than this thing, but granted, it is a very awesome car to look at, and I guess it's something a little bit different. Anyways, on to the times, and the Skyline was the quickest car of the day, going into 16th for 122.140, beats out an Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale. Just underneath that, Dodge Charger Daytona going into 18th for 123.231, beats a Caterham Supra and two Ford GTs, which is pretty good. Toyota Supra, surprisingly enough, actually gets into 23rd with 124.240, which when you look at the PI of the car, isn't particularly good, but when you consider the way it drove, it's pretty good. It's 1,000th of a second quicker than an RS6 Avant, so yeah, that's actually a decent time from the Supra, especially considering how much of a handful that car was to drive. Moving down the board, the Corvette C2 goes into 26th with a 124.531, beats out TVS Agaris and a Lotus 6 Siege, which is very good. The Fairlady goes into 30th with a 125.111, beats a Dodge Viper and a Jaguar XK RS, which is pretty decent. The Honda S2000, my favourite car of the day, goes into 33rd with a 125.640, beats out a Lotus Elise and a Mercedes C63 S Coupe. That is a seriously quick car, and it is seriously nice to drive. Again, if you're going to drive any of the cars here today, you should definitely go drive that S2000. It's really good. And going down the board, we find the Eclipse in 50th for 129.333, which for a front-wheel drive car is bloody impressive. It beats a Shelby Cobra. which is very good. The Escort goes into 52nd, marred by its handling, 129.577. Still beats an RX-7 though, which is pretty decent. And the Dodge Charger Raid, 54th, 129.751. It does beat out Lotus Carlton and the Toyota Supra, but that was really some last lap magic with that car. That Raid Charger is so difficult to drive, and I did not like any moment of that. Anyways, there you go. So, surprisingly enough, the Fast and Furious cars can actually hold their own when you compare them to some road-going cars, which is pretty decent. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at the cars of the Need for Speed franchise, some iconic cars from that franchise, so hopefully you all look forward to that. And as always, if you've got any suggestions for themes or cars you'd like to see go around the Top Gear track, leave them down below in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. Anyways, as always, thank you all very much for watching. My name has been the Real Emile, and until next time, a farewell.